Hey everybody, it is late at night and I am Norman. A bit ago I did a video on the troubles of owning mechanical watches, and in that video I discussed how expensive servicing is if you end up acquiring a bunch of those watches. For example, I own a lot of mechanical watches and I have a long list of watches that are going to need to be serviced. And many of those watches were so cheap that servicing them is going to be more than the watch was. In some cases, quite a bit more. And if there is any problems with their movements, it may be difficult to source replacement parts for them. So tonight I'm going to talk about the downside of owning quartz watches. So we'll take a look at it from the other side of the issue. Let us begin. So first off, what are some of the benefits of owning quartz watches? Well, they don't really need servicing for the most part, and I'm not talking about mecha quartz. Those watches, I believe you actually do need to have service because they have mechanical components in them, but they're driven by quartz. So the upside there is the mechanical portion of the watch could be serviced and should be serviced, but you have increased accuracy, and the watch could sit on a shelf for ever until the battery dies. So you still have the ease of a watch that is just pick up and go, but you have the mechanical component along with that. However, straight up quartz watches just seem to keep going and going and going. I mean, I own a whole bunch of vintage Swatch watches, and those were cheap throwaway watches, but every single one that I own actually runs. The pieces that are having issues right now, they're having those issues because the battery hatch, one of the latches on it, has broken off and it allows it to tilt out just enough for the battery to lose contact, and so they periodically stop working. But in general, quartz watches are just low maintenance watches. They just keep on going. And you can rough them up. They aren't full of really tiny, intricate, delicate components. They have a module in them. So they're great for sportier pieces that are going to take a real beating. They're less expensive than mechanical watches. It's really cheap to make a quartz movement. And there's the pick up and go factor. You can have watches sitting on your shelf for a month, and when you decide to wear them, they're already set and ready to go. And the accuracy. They are amazingly accurate. So if you buy an old quartz watch, it's still going to way outperform your mechanical watches unless they're just in amazing shape, brand new and absolutely dialed in. But over time, those watches are going to become less accurate, but that quartz piece is still going to be just spot on. But there are definitely drawbacks to quartz watches. So being cheap to produce and being cheaper than mechanical watches, I feel is a positive and a negative thing. Quartz watches are so cheap to make. You can buy a $5, $10 watch and it'll last for a long time, because even though the quartz movement that's in it is like $1 to produce or whatever they cost, it'll just keep on going. And I feel like because of that cheapness, it can actually cheapen watches in general, because you just have a market flooded with crappy, cheap, throwaway watches, most of which don't even look all that great. So I feel like as a whole, it's kind of a negative in the watch space that it's so cheap. And in fact, it's so cheap, so easy, so low maintenance that back in the day, quartz killed so many brilliant brands. It's really sad as I'm going through eBay and I'm seeing all these vintage watches, and some of them are brands that are still around today, but when you look at what they used to produce before they kind of died and got picked up by another company and revitalized, the watches they produce now are just, a lot of them, not good. Like when I explored Wittnauer, my vintage gold Wittnauer is absolutely brilliant, but the pieces that they're making now are just, yeah, They're just soulless and without any kind of personality. If you took the branding off them, they could be any watch. Absolutely any brand's watch. And that soullessness is another thing. When you look at a mechanical movement, all of the amazing innovations over hundreds of years are all on display right in front of your eyes. You can see the genius behind horology right there. You look at a quartz movement, you'll see a coil, you'll see a battery, and that's about it. Everything else is just kind of hidden behind a plate or encased in plastic. And I don't know about higher end quartz movements, but I'm pretty sure with the lower end quartz movements, if anything goes wrong with them, you're just kind of out of luck. You would have to find a replacement movement somewhere, and I'm not sure how easy those are to find, especially if we're going back to watches from the 1980s. I would imagine that it would be tough to find a replacement quartz movement for those. And with mecha quartz, it's almost even worse. So you have the mechanical portions that could go wrong, get damaged, or wear and tear, but then you also have the quartz aspect of it. And honestly, I've never looked at a mecha quartz movement, but I imagine that it has a small quartz module in it, just like a standard quartz movement. And if that goes bad, surely it would need to be replaced. And if you own quartz movements with high water resistance, you have to send them off when the battery dies. So I own the CWC G10 Sapphire, and it has dive watch water resistance. When its battery dies, I'm going to have to send it off probably to CWC. That way I ensure that it still has that dive level of water resistance. There's absolutely no way I'm changing that battery myself. But I guess maybe that could be a positive thing, because when you send it in, they can double check the gaskets and everything and retest the water resistance, so maybe that's a plus, actually. But batteries are super cheap, which is cool. They're easy to get. You can go onto Amazon and get a pack of 5 or 10 batteries for a few dollars. At least the batteries that I've had to purchase. However, if you don't have the tools to change those batteries yourself, you're going to have to take them into somebody, and the guy that I go to charges a minimum of $20. I think the last time I had a battery changed on a higher end watch, it was closer to $30 or $40 just to change a battery. And if you do have the tools, you still have to be extremely careful. Even though you're just changing a battery, it is so easy to do harm to your watch. As I found out when I tried changing the battery on my Projects watch for the second time. I had done it one time before, but the dial on that watch is fixed in place, so the hands and whatnot are accessed by removing the bezel and getting at them that way, and I think the dial comes out the front. So when you're changing the battery, if the movement lifts up at all, it'll pop the hands right off of their posts, and that's what happened to me. However, even though batteries are cheap, and even if you have the tools to change them yourself, if you end up with a lot of quartz watches, it's kind of tedious, and at least I end up with piles of watches that need new batteries, and I just haven't bothered to track down what they take, what kinds of batteries they take, which alone is a downside. My Fossil Stark watch, I had no idea what battery went in that thing. Neither did Fossil, neither did the internet. I took it into my watch guy, and because he had drawers and drawers of batteries, he was able to find out what it took, but something had gone bad with the digital display on that watch, so yeah, it's no longer a watch. But even though they're extremely affordable as opposed to servicing, you just end up kind of leaving the watches on shelves. I really ought to go through and purchase batteries for all my dead swatches and Henry London. I've got a few other watches. Yeah, I'll just have to start buying loads of batteries. And speaking of batteries, another downside of quartz watches is that battery can die at any time. And if you have a two-hander watch, which I personally prefer, you might not realize at first that the battery is dead. and that could be a problem if you have an upcoming work meeting or something. Also, even on Amazon, the wait times when you order batteries is super long. I mean, most things that you buy there, it's there sometimes the same day, or at most a couple days later, but batteries, I think every time I purchase batteries, I have to wait weeks for them. So just bear that in mind. If you are going to be replacing batteries, you may have to wait a little while for them. But in spite of all the downsides and whatnot, I feel like there are plenty of Quartz watches out there that are not soulless. I mean, one of my favorite watches in my collection is a Quartz watch, the Longines Dolce Vita. And I mean, just look at that. How is that soulless? Such a gorgeous watch. So yes, it has a quartz movement in it, but this watch is still absolutely brilliant, and I wear it all the time. Although in the case of the Dolce Vita, being a quartz watch did not mean that it was any cheaper than the mechanical ones. Yeah, it was also an expensive watch. When I first started collecting watches, I had zero interest in quartz watches whatsoever. If it wasn't mechanical, if it wasn't brand new and mechanical, I wanted nothing to do with it. But then I started seeing pieces like the CWC in person, and that watch is just great. And so in time, I kind of was okay with secondary watches, watches that I'm probably not going to wear very often. Those made more sense to be quartz. I could just pull them out of the watch box and they're running, because I'm probably going to wear them for maybe a day and then put them back in the box for a while. But then I started encountering the next level quartz pieces like the Dolce Vita. And I think I'm 50-50. Like when I'm on eBay shopping for older watches from the 70s or 80s, I almost prefer quartz because I really don't want to have to deal with the servicing or the accuracy. I just want a piece that's going to run and look nice and vintage, be nice and vintage size. Yeah, just a low maintenance watch to add to my huge growing pile of watches. So there you have it, the downside of owning quartz watches. Thanks for watching.